Hi everybody, welcome to this lecture where we're going to talk about population geography and a little bit about measurements of development. So in this section we'll do some of the stuff where we get a little deeper into the subjects in class, but for this video lecture we're going to talk about some of the basics of understanding how we look at population. And population is actually really important to look at in this subject because when we're talking about different parts of the world and the cultures and the economies and the politics and all that sort of thing, it's important to know stuff about the population. Like, is it a old population, a young one? Is it a fast-growing population? Is it a small population? These things have really big effects on all the other aspects of kind of human society. And that's why we need to kind of think a little bit about it. And that's what we're going to do in this section. So the four big points that we're going to hit in this lecture is we're going to talk about how we measure population. We're going to talk about how populations change. We're going to talk about how we can kind of show populations in a way that helps us compare different places against each other. And we'll also look a little bit about how we measure how well off a population is, like how it's doing economically. So to start with, just sort of the general definition of population geography, like what we're kind of doing when we're looking at population around the world, is that it's the study of the spatial and ecological aspects of population. In other words, we want to look at the distribution, like where are people at? We want to look at the density, like how many people there are per square unit of area, like per square mile. We also want to look at things like fertility, sex ratios, how healthy populations are they old or young? Also, like, what are the death rates, and are people moving in or out of a particular place? This kind of tells us something about the number of people that are there and what the population looks like. So to start with, in terms of measurements of population, we tend to talk about population not just in terms of numbers of people, but how many people there are per, say, square mile, like in a unit of area. And the reason why is it gives us a much better idea of what life is like in those places. So for instance, New Hampshire has about 1.2, 1.3 million people. And that means that, but they're spread out over the whole state. Whereas you think about a place like Manhattan Island, which has many millions of people, but they're squeezed into a very small space, right? The density is much higher. And so this gives us an indication of what life is like, how many people are kind of squeezed into one area. And the reason we're interested in this is that people are actually very unevenly distributed around the world. So for instance, 19% of all humans reside in China, 17% of all humans reside in India. And when you think about things that are going on here in the United States, we actually represent only 4.4% of the world's population. As a matter of fact, if you take the entire world and try and figure out where the people are, there are more people that live inside this circle, right, this area, than live everywhere else on the whole world. And so this has got China, India, Southeast Asia, Japan, right? These sort of areas. So more than half of the world's population lives in this area. So it shows you just how uneven it is really around the whole world. And this is just a diagram or a map showing you a little more specifically what it looks like in terms of where population is most dense, right? So here, this is population per square mile. So the places that are purple have over 250 people per square mile. So places like Eastern China, almost all of India, some parts of Northern Europe. And we get a little bit of that too around Chicago and, down here in, around the big cities like New York, Boston, that sort of thing. But you can see that, some parts of the world are pretty empty, like the Sahara Desert, Australia, the Intermountain West here, Canada, those sort of areas. And this is looking a little more specifically at the United States, where the darker red, the more densely populated. So you see we have a lot of dense population here on the eastern coast, and it kind of thins out as you move west, and then you get another big jump in amount of population as you get out towards California, Oregon, and Washington. Okay. But sometimes talking about population density doesn't tell you everything, because certain places are able to essentially support larger populations. So the reason why places like India and Eastern China have so many people is they're very rich agricultural areas. The climate is mild. You can produce a lot of agriculture and food to feed people in those areas. The reason you don't have a whole bunch of people in northern Canada is that it's much harder to grow stuff. There's not as many resources, and so it can't support as big of a density of population. And that leads us to this concept called carrying capacity, which has to do with the maximum number of organisms, in our case, talking about humans, the maximum number of humans that a certain area can support. And this idea comes from biology, and it's usually applied to other species. So for instance, we might talk about fish in a pond, like how many fish can exist there. And, all animals and plants have the ability to reproduce more than just replacing themselves, right? So like humans, over the span of a lifetime, if we were really working at it, we could probably produce 20 children, right? We can more than reproduce ourselves. But what keeps populations down is the fact that you have limits like decreasing resources, diseases, predators, limited amounts of space. And so in the case of fish, kind of keeps populations in a pond down, not because they can't have more babies, but because those babies basically can't survive, right? There are things in the environment kind of keeping those numbers lower. The one thing about carrying capacity in humans, however, is that we can do some things that are a little tricky. Not only do we migrate, and other animals migrate too, like, there's certain birds that migrate, and buffalo used to migrate across the Great Plains, all that sort of thing. But we have the ability of taking resources from one place and putting them somewhere else. So going back to my example of Manhattan in New York, yes, there may be several million people that live there, but that's because they're pulling in resources from all around the world and bringing them to New York. The island itself couldn't usually sustain 3 million people. The only reason it can is because humans have the ability to make these large chains of, kind of supplies that they can bring in from other places. So then the question is are humans kind of subject to the same pressures as other species? Well, in some ways, yes, but in other ways, no. And we're going to talk about that a little more when we talk about population perspectives in the lecture this coming week. But to go on to a couple of terms that I want you to know, when we're looking at populations, we want to know a few major things, right? How many people are being born, how many people are dying, and how many people are moving in or out. So when we're talking about how many people are born in a particular population, we call that natality. And so sometimes people talk about the birth rate, which is just like how many babies are being born per 1,000 people in a population. But what's actually a more effective way of kind of understanding what's going on in a population is through a term that we call through a measure called the total fertility rate, or TFR. And that is the average number of children that will be born per woman over their reproductive lifetime. And so if a woman in a society on average is having 6 kids, that means you have a growing population, right? Because for every 2 people making a baby, you'd have 6 the next generation. So it's getting bigger and bigger. If, however, you wanted to have a stable population, it would be closer to 2, right? Each woman having 2 children sort of replaces the people that currently exist. What's tricky, though, is it's not exactly 2. A term that's really important, and it's one I love to put on exams, is what is the total fertility rate that will keep your population totally even, like keep your population at the same number, make it stable. They also refer to this as zero population growth. The number is actually 2.1. And the reason why it's 2.1 is that you have the 2 people to replace the parents, but it's 0.1 because not all children are going to live to the age of being reproductive age and to have children themselves. And so you actually have to have a little bit more than 2 to have an even population. In a population, if your TFR is exactly 2, you will actually have a slightly declining population over time. And so that's what you have for zero population growth. In the United States now, we actually have a TFR below 2.1. It's actually below 2. And that means that we actually the population is, in that sense, shrinking in terms of births. However, because there's also migration into the United States, that kind of keeps our numbers actually slightly growing. And total fertility rate differs a lot from country to country. And of course, 2.1 is that magic number here. And you can see the United States, Russia, Europe, China, all these places have below 2.1. But there are some places where the total fertility rate, the average number of kids a woman will have over her lifetime is over 6 in parts of Central Africa, Central Asia, these sort of areas. And so it differs a lot from place to place. The flip side of births, of course, in terms of understanding a population, is deaths. And for deaths, we tend to talk about this as how many deaths per 1,000 people. And of course, people die of different things at different ages, developing world, things like malaria, HIV/AIDS, etc., cause a lot more deaths. Whereas in the developed world, people tend to die older, of more degenerative conditions, heart disease, that sort of thing. And if we look at the death rate per 1,000 residents, one of the things you'll notice is that it mirrors a little bit the TFR, right? The places that have high numbers of children being born per woman also have fairly high death rates. One glaring exception to this, you might notice, is Russia and some of the other countries of Eastern Europe. Not only do they have very high death rates, but their birth rates are very low. In other words, they have pretty crashing kind of populations. And then lastly, of course, migration. That's people moving in or out of your population. And as we've talked about in this class already in previous sections, people move. They always have, and they continue to do so now. And whether people move or not, kind of the decision to move, is up to a lot of different factors. But one thing to keep in mind is that places that used to be areas that received immigrants sometimes are now sending them, and the other way around. Like, so for instance, Europe for many centuries was losing population. People were migrating out of Europe and coming to North America, to Australia, to Latin America, to South Africa, to all these other places. Now people are trying to migrate to Europe, whereas Latin America used to be a place that a lot of people were migrating to. Now there's people migrating out. And so these things change and shift over time. So the kind of patterns we see today may not be the patterns we see in the future. International migration was at an all-time high right before the pandemic, but and most people migrate. The reason most people migrate is economics. It's for jobs, getting jobs in particular places. However, there are other reasons people leave as refugees, people fleeing from persecution in their country of nationality because of either religious reasons, political reasons, racial discrimination, those sort of things. And some people are migrate because they're forced to. They're being literally forced out of where they're at. And when we talk about migration, we typically talk about what we call push and pull factors. Those are the reasons why you are moving. A push factor is that you're the unfavorable or conditions that are kind of pushing you out, repelling you from where you were. Pull factors are the things that are bringing you towards this new location. Generally, push factors are by far the most important. If we're looking at why people move, usually it's because they're being pushed out of a place. And if we look at the world in terms of where people are moving out and where they're moving in, again, this is pre-pandemic, but you can see the places that really have a lot of migration in, the Gulf states here, Northern Europe, Canada, Australia, the US kind of in the middle, and the places where people are leaving. I think this data may be even, well, you can see there's people leaving Syria, Somalia, Libya, other areas like that. And some surprises like Ireland, Iceland, I didn't know, in terms of where people are moving in and out. But again, this shifts over time. And then one more thing here is population pyramids. These are ways of presenting what a population looks like in a particular place. Because in any society, you have not only people at different ages, you also have people of different sexes, right? Males and females. And this is what's called the sex ratio. It's not, you would think that it's usually 1-to-1 ratio, just as many women as men, but that's not necessarily always the case. To start with, there are slightly more boys born than girls, but boys die in utero and in infancy at greater numbers than girls do. And so by the time you actually get to reproductive age, you have usually about a 1-to-1 ratio. But then as you even get older, women generally outlive men. And so you have this kind of skewing at different ages of women versus men in a society. And again, geographically, this varies. So for instance, if you look at, 1 would mean that you have equal numbers of men and women. And you can see places like Peru, Bolivia have about 1-to-1. However, places like the United States, what these numbers mean here, like say here with say 0.9, that means that for every 100 women, there are 9 men. Okay. Whereas here, 1.1, that means that for every 10 women, there are 11 men. So in other words, the redder means more men versus women versus the other direction. So you can see places like the Gulf states have much higher numbers of men than they do women. Places like China and India also have higher numbers of men than women. And then you have countries that have more women. Russia, Eastern Europe, and these other countries. And a lot of the reason for that is that because their populations are older and women tend to outlive men. So if you have an older population, there's going to be more women, right? So some of the ways that we depict the way age and sex are kind of distributed within a society is through what we call population pyramids, or sometimes called age-sex pyramids. And they basically look like this. This is an example of Botswana. And what's going on here is that in this graph, these are ages. So all the people between the ages of 0 and 4, and we've got men on one side and women on the other, or males and females. This means that there's about 120,000 men between the ages of 0 and 4. You have about 125,000 men between the ages of 5 and 9, etc. And then over here, say between ages of 20 and 24, looks like you've got about 123,000 women. But the one thing you can see is by the general shape, it tells you something about what's going on in that population. So for instance, Botswana is a growing population. For the most part, every generation is getting a little bit bigger. So this tells you they're growing. You can see at the very end here, the growth is slowing a little bit because this generation is not quite as big as the one prior to it. If you look at an older country like Japan, you see a very different kind of shape to the pyramid. You see much older population. You see each generation getting a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller. So this shows you a declining population and an old one. You can also see other kinds of effects, like they have a baby boomer group just like the United States does. People born after World War II. And then you get this kind of boom in births that happened at that point, and then a little bit less after that. But then when those people get old enough to have babies, even if they have them at the same rate, it causes what's called an echo effect, where you also, when these people have babies, there's more of these people around, so they have more babies, right? And so that's why you can sometimes get these little shapes to the pyramids. But they tell you something about the place and what the population's like. This is China. Also a declining population, but they're not quite as old as Japan. They're kind of more in the middle in terms of their ages. South Korea, somewhat similar. And then here in the United States, we're not as skewed as Japan or China or those kinds of ones, but you can still see our baby boomers here and the echo effect. But our population is declining slightly in terms of births, but it is still holding relatively steady. And then sometimes you get really wacky ones, like this is Russia. And you can see the effects of old wars. You can see a lot more females than males at the older ages. And then you can also see the total kind of like population collapse as birth rates have really gone through the floor in Russia in the past 20 so years, like since the fall of the Soviet Union. And here's just showing like birth rates are here in blue. And then you can see like the Civil War and World War I caused a ton of deaths. And then again in World War II. And then at the end of the Soviet Union, you also see death rates go up and birth rates really crash. Then the last thing in this lecture is looking at how well off is the population. And the most common way we measure this is through what's called gross domestic product. This is the total dollar value of all goods and services produced in a country over, say, a year. But oftentimes we'll take that number of all the stuff being produced in an economy and divide it by the number of people. That gives you an idea of the amount being produced per person. And so we usually talk about it as gross domestic product per capita. It gives you an average, but it doesn't tell you much about inequality, like the fact that there's some rich people and some poor people. It just sort of averages how much is being produced per person. And if you look at the countries that produce the most, this is from the year 2000. You can see the US, European Union, Japan was about half of the global economy. China and India together about 16%, and then you have some of the other big Asian economies like Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. here in this, and then the rest of the world. But this is shifting rapidly. So this is 2000. The estimate is by 2040, this is what it's going to look like. where the US, Europe, and Japan actually have less than a quarter of the world's economy, and China and India will flip from being 16% to being close to 50%. So you're seeing a big shift right now in the global economy, and of course the way the pandemic will play out will affect this as well. One thing about gross domestic product, however, is it doesn't take into account everything that's important in a population in terms of how good people are doing. So some people decided to come up with a measure that is a little more holistic and takes into account other aspects of living somewhere. And this is called the Human Development Index, is one of these ways of doing this. This does include gross domestic product as one of the measures, right? How much stuff is being made, productivity, but it also includes education, like how many adults can read, how many kids finish school, those sort of things. And it also includes life expectancy, and the reason for that is that it basically shows how good is health and healthcare. So it's sort of like health, education, and economic production. And the results you get from this Human Development Index are such that it shows different parts of the world as being better off than others. And we'll actually do an exercise in class where we look at Human Development Index and what countries come up high and which ones are kind of lower. And then the last point here too is that even if you know that a country is overall pretty well off, it doesn't tell you how unequal the money or the benefits of, like education or healthcare is in a society. So some people came up with what's called the Gini coefficient, which is an inequality index. Some countries have massive income inequality and some have less. And you'll watch a video about income inequality in the US as part of this online section for this segment of the class. But one thing to keep in mind when you're watching the video is that the US is actually globally sort of in the middle in terms of income inequality. We certainly have a lot. It's about the same as what China has. But there are other countries with much worse, like particularly in places like South Africa and other areas where there are places that have much lower inequality, much less difference between the rich and their poor, in places like Norway and Central Europe and Northern Europe, those sort of things. So you'll see that in the other video associated with this section. So that's it. Please go ahead and make sure that you go and also answer the discussion questions for this section, and I will see you in class.